welcome to the deep dive. We're going really, really small today.
Yep.
Like as small as it gets in biology. We're talking about cells.
You got it. Right down to the fundamental building blocks of you.
I've been looking over all the material you sent over, and there's so much here. It's kind of overwhelming.
It is, yeah. Cells, I mean, they're tiny but incredibly complex.
Well, that's what we do here on the deep dive. We take all this stuff and try to, break it down.
Yeah, distill it down into something understandable.
Exactly.
And hopefully interesting, because even though they're tiny, the world of the cell is anything but boring.
So just starting off, when we say cell, what exactly are we talking about?
It really is the simplest, smallest living thing, the most fundamental unit of life that makes up all living organisms. And in the human body, you're talking about trillions of them.
Trillions, wow. And they're all working together somehow.
Yeah. It's mind-blowing, a complex, coordinated society of cells that form tissues and organs, and ultimately you.
So there must be an incredible variety of cells to make up all the different parts of the body.
You're absolutely right. We have hundreds of different types of cells, each with its own unique shape, size, and function.
I'm thinking, round cells, maybe square cells. What kind of shapes are we talking about?
Well, you do have some cells that are roundish, like red blood cells, but you also have flat cells, like skin cells, that fit together tightly like a mosaic.
Okay, I can picture that.
Then you have long and thin nerve cells, some stretching over a meter long, transmitting signals throughout your body.
Wow, a meter long. That's incredible.
Yeah. And then short, thick muscle cells, packed with contractile proteins that allow you to move.
So not just shapes, sizes too.
Exactly. A huge range in size. You have tiny granule cells in your brain, just a few micrometers across.
Micrometers?
Yeah, a micrometer is 1/1,000,000th of a meter, so incredibly small. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have oocytes, the cells that develop into egg cells, which can be up to 100 micrometers in diameter.
Okay, so tiny, tiny to still tiny, but much bigger.
Exactly. All this diversity, and each one precisely designed to carry out a specific role.
It makes you appreciate just how complex we are.
Right. And yet all these specialized cells share some common features, the basic blueprint, you could say.
Okay, so what are these common features, these building blocks that unite every cell in our body?
Well, every human cell, with a few exceptions we'll get to later, has three main components. First, you have the plasma membrane, also called the cell membrane.
Okay, the membrane is like the outer skin of the cell, right?
You got it. It's a thin, flexible barrier that separates the cell's interior from the outside world.
But it can't be completely sealed off. It has to let things in and out, right?
Exactly. The plasma membrane is what we call selectively permeable. It regulates what can enter and exit the cell.
So it's like a gatekeeper.
Yeah, a very sophisticated gatekeeper. Absolutely essential for maintaining the cell's internal environment, its equilibrium.
Makes sense. Okay, what's the second component?
Within the plasma membrane, you have the cytoplasm.
Cytoplasm. What's that exactly?
One source I came across described it as mixed fruit jelly, which I think is a pretty great analogy.
Mixed fruit jelly. That's a weird way to put it.
But it works. The jelly part is the cytosol, which is a watery solution that contains all sorts of molecules and ions essential for the cell's functions.
Okay. And I'm guessing the fruit pieces are?
The organelles. These are specialized structures within the cytoplasm, each with its own unique function.
Like little organs within the cell.
Exactly. Each one contributing to the overall health and operation of the cell. Some of them, like the nucleus we'll talk about in more detail later, are enclosed by their own membranes, similar to the plasma membrane.
It's like a miniature city inside each cell. Amazing. So what about that third component you mentioned?
That would be the nucleus, the big boss.
The nucleus, the control center.
Precisely. The largest organelle in most cells, and it's where the cell's DNA is stored.
DNA, the genetic material. So it's the brain of the operation.
In a way, yes. The DNA contains all the instructions the cell needs to function.
The blueprints for life. Okay, this is all starting to come together. You also mentioned the terms intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid.
Right. ICF and ECF for short.
What are those exactly?
Well, intracellular fluid, or ICF, is everything inside the cell. The cytosol, the organelles, the nucleus, it's all the fluid and stuff contained within that plasma membrane.
Okay, so like the cell's internal environment.
Exactly. And then extracellular fluid, ECF, is everything outside the cell. The fluid that surrounds and bathes all the cells in your body.
So it's like the cell's external environment.
And an important part of that ECF is plasma, the fluid component of your blood. It's like the highway system connecting all the cells, allowing them to communicate and exchange nutrients and waste.
That makes sense. So everything's connected through this fluid network.
It's really quite remarkable, a vast interconnected system at the microscopic level.
Okay, let's go back to that plasma membrane, the gatekeeper.
Yeah.
How does it actually work? How does it decide what to let in and out?
It all comes down to its structure. The plasma membrane is made up of what's called a phospholipid bilayer.
A phospholipid bilayer. That sounds complicated.
It's actually quite simple. Imagine two layers of phospholipid molecules arranged tail to tail. Each phospholipid has a head that likes water and two tails that don't.
So the heads are facing out.
Exactly. The hydrophilic heads face outwards, interacting with the watery ICF inside the cell and the watery ECF outside the cell. And the hydrophobic tails are tucked away inside the membrane, away from the water.
So it's like a sandwich with the water-loving bread on the outside and the water-hating filling on the inside.
A very accurate analogy. This creates a barrier that many substances, especially those that dissolve in water, can't easily pass through.
It makes sense that the cell needs that protection.
But the membrane isn't just a passive barrier. Embedded within this bilayer, you have other molecules that play crucial roles.
Like what?
Well, first you have cholesterol, another type of lipid.
Cholesterol. Isn't that bad?
It can be in excess, but in the cell membrane, it actually helps to stabilize the structure, making it more rigid and less fluid.
So it's like adding some stiffness to the membrane.
Precisely. It's like adding scaffolding to a building. It helps the membrane maintain its shape and integrity.
Interesting. What else is in there?
Proteins. And they do all sorts of things.
Proteins are like the workhorses of the cell, right?
Exactly. Some proteins span the entire width of the membrane. These are called integral proteins. Others, called peripheral proteins, are attached to either the inner or outer surface of the membrane.
Okay, so you've got proteins going through the membrane and proteins hanging out on either side. What do they do?
Well, some of these integral proteins act as channels or transporters. They create pathways for specific molecules and ions to cross the membrane.
So they're like tiny tunnels or gateways.
Exactly, and they're very specific. A particular channel might only let sodium ions through, for example. Another one might be specific for glucose.
It's like a very selective border crossing.
Perfect analogy. And these channels and transporters are essential for regulating the flow of substances in and out of the cell.
Okay, so that's how the cell gets the nutrients it needs and gets rid of waste products.
Right. And some of these integral proteins act as receptors.
Receptors, like antennas.
Kind of. They bind to specific molecules, like hormones that come from outside the cell.
It's like a lock and key.
Exactly. And when a hormone binds to its receptor, it triggers a specific response inside the cell. It's how cells communicate with each other and respond to changes in their environment.
So those are the integral proteins, the ones spanning the membrane. What about the peripheral proteins?
They have a variety of functions too. Some act as structural anchors, attaching the membrane to the cytoskeleton inside the cell, helping to maintain its shape.
So they're like the support beams.
Yeah. And others are enzymes.
Enzymes, aren't those involved in chemical reactions?
Precisely. Enzymes are catalysts. They speed up chemical reactions, and some enzymes are embedded in the membrane, facilitating reactions that occur at the cell's surface.
Okay, so we've got cholesterol, integral proteins, and peripheral proteins. What else?
Finally, you have glycoproteins and glycolipids.
Those new ones, what are they?
They're basically proteins and lipids that have sugars attached to them.
Sugars. What are they doing in the membrane?
These sugar molecules stick out from the cell surface and they act as identification markers.
So they're like the cell's name tag.
Exactly. They allow cells to recognize each other and distinguish self from non-self, which is really important for the immune system.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So it's not just a simple barrier. It's a complex, dynamic structure with all these different components working together.
Right. The plasma membrane is much more than just a wall. It's a sophisticated communication hub, a selective gateway, and a platform for all sorts of essential cellular processes.
Okay, let's move on to the nucleus now, the cell's command center. You said earlier that most human cells have a nucleus. Are there any exceptions?
Yeah, there are a few. The most notable exception are mature red blood cells.
Red blood cells. Why don't they have a nucleus?
Well, they actually start with a nucleus, but they get rid of it as they mature.
Why would they do that?
It's all about efficiency. Red blood cells are packed with hemoglobin, the protein that carries oxygen. And by ejecting the nucleus, they free up more space to carry more hemoglobin.
So they're like specialized cargo ships.
Exactly. They've sacrificed their control center to become incredibly efficient oxygen transporters.
That makes sense. But for the vast majority of cells, the nucleus is essential.
Absolutely. It's the largest organelle, and it's actually the only one you can see with a simple light microscope.
So it's big enough to see with a basic microscope.
Yeah. All the other organelles are much smaller and require more powerful microscopes to visualize.
Wow, okay, and it's surrounded by that nuclear envelope you mentioned earlier.
Right. The nuclear envelope is a double membrane, 2 layers of phospholipids, just like the plasma membrane.
So double the protection for the DNA.
Exactly. It keeps the DNA safely enclosed and separated from the cytoplasm.
But there must be some way for things to get in and out of the nucleus.
There is. The nuclear envelope is dotted with nuclear pores.
Pores, like little holes.
Yeah. They're not just simple holes, though. They're complex structures that regulate the passage of molecules between the nucleus and the cytoplasm.
So it's another layer of control, like the channels in the plasma membrane.
Precisely. Proteins needed for DNA replication and transcription have to get into the nucleus, and RNA molecules, which carry the genetic instructions from the DNA to the ribosomes, have to get out.
It's like a busy border crossing with all this traffic going in and out.
And the DNA inside the nucleus isn't just floating around randomly. It's organized into a complex structure called chromatin.
Chromatin.
It's essentially DNA wrapped around special proteins called histones.
Why is it wrapped up like that?
It's all about space efficiency. The DNA molecule is incredibly long. If you stretched out all the DNA in a single human cell, it would be about 6 feet long.
6 feet. But a cell is microscopic.
Exactly. So the DNA has to be tightly packed to fit inside the nucleus, and this packaging also helps to regulate gene expression, which genes are turned on or off.
Okay, that makes sense. And you also mentioned a nucleolus inside the nucleus.
Right. The nucleolus is a distinct region within the nucleus where ribosomes are assembled.
Ribosomes, those are the protein synthesis factories.
Exactly. The nucleolus is where ribosomal RNA, or rRNA, is produced and then combined with proteins to make ribosomes.
So it's like the ribosome factory. And our sources mentioned a connection between the nuclear envelope and the endoplasmic reticulum.
Yes, the outer membrane of the nuclear envelope is actually continuous with the membrane of the endoplasmic reticulum, or ER.
So they're physically connected.
They are. It reflects their close functional relationship, especially when it comes to protein synthesis and transport.
Okay, let's head out of the nucleus now and into the cytoplasm. We talked about organelles before. Can you remind me again what they are?
Organelles are basically the functional units of the cytoplasm. They're like the organs of the cell, each with its own specialized job to do.
And many of them are enclosed by membranes, right?
Yes, that compartmentalization is really important. It allows different processes to occur simultaneously without interfering with each other.
So it's like having different rooms in a factory.
Perfect analogy. You have the assembly line in one room, packaging in another, and so on.
Okay, so let's talk about some specific organelles. What about mitochondria?
The mitochondria, often called the powerhouses of the cell.
Powerhouses, what do they do?
They're responsible for producing ATP, the cell's main energy currency.
ATP.
Adenosine triphosphate. It's a molecule that stores energy in its chemical bonds, and cells use it to power all sorts of processes.
So the mitochondria are like the cell's energy plants.
Exactly. And cells that require a lot of energy, like muscle cells, have lots and lots of mitochondria.
Makes sense. What about ribosomes?
Ribosomes are the protein synthesis machines. They take the genetic instructions from the DNA, carried by messenger RNA, and use them to build proteins.
Proteins are essential for pretty much everything the cell does, right?
Yeah. They're involved in structure, function, signaling, pretty much everything.
And ribosomes come in 2 flavors, right? Free and attached.
Right. Ribosomes that are attached to the endoplasmic reticulum synthesize proteins that are destined for secretion outside the cell or for insertion into the cell membrane.
So they're like the export department.
And the free ribosomes, the ones floating around in the cytoplasm, make proteins that will stay and function inside the cell.
Okay, so it depends on where the protein needs to go. What about that endoplasmic reticulum? We haven't really talked about that yet.
The ER is a network of interconnected membranes that extends throughout the cytoplasm.
Like a maze of tunnels and chambers.
Yeah, something like that.
Right.
And there are 2 types, rough ER and smooth ER.
Rough and smooth. What's the difference?
The rough ER is studded with ribosomes, giving it that rough appearance under a microscope.
So it's involved in protein synthesis.
Right. The ribosomes on the rough ER make proteins that will be inserted into the ER membrane or transported to other organelles.
Okay. And the smooth ER?
The smooth ER doesn't have ribosomes. It's involved in lipid synthesis, detoxification, and calcium storage.
Lipids.
Fats and oils, they're an important component of cell membranes.
Right. So the smooth ER is like the lipid factory.
Exactly. And the detoxification part is really important, especially in the liver. It helps to break down harmful substances.
Keeps our bodies clean. Okay, what about the Golgi apparatus?
The Golgi is like the post office of the cell.
The post office.
Yeah. It receives proteins from the ER, modifies them, sorts them, and packages them into vesicles for transport to other organelles or for secretion outside the cell.
So it's like the processing and shipping center.
Exactly. It's a highly organized and efficient system.
Vesicles, what are those?
Vesicles are small membrane-bound sacs that transport materials around the cell.
So they're like the delivery trucks.
Precisely. And there are different types of vesicles, each specialized for carrying a particular type of cargo.
Makes sense. What about lysosomes and peroxisomes?
Lysosomes are the cell's recycling centers. They contain enzymes that break down worn-out organelles, cellular debris, and engulfed bacteria.
So they're like the garbage disposal.
Yeah, but they also recycle the building blocks of the broken-down materials so the cell can reuse them.
Efficient. And peroxisomes.
Peroxisomes are involved in breaking down fatty acids and detoxifying harmful substances.
So they're kind of like specialized lysosomes.
In a way, yes. They have different sets of enzymes, though, and they play distinct roles in cellular metabolism.
Okay. We also have to talk about the cytoskeleton. It's not a membrane-bound organelle, but it's still crucial.
Absolutely. The cytoskeleton is a network of protein fibers that provides structural support for the cell and helps to maintain its shape.
So it's like the cell's internal scaffolding.
Exactly. And it also acts as a track system for transporting organelles and vesicles around the cell.
That's like the cell's highway system as well.
Precisely. It's a dynamic and complex network that's essential for many cellular processes.
Okay, what about centrioles?
Centrioles are involved in cell division. They help to organize the microtubules that pull the chromosomes apart.
So they're like the traffic cops of cell division.
A good analogy. They make sure the chromosomes are divided equally between the two daughter cells.
Okay, so we've covered most of the major organelles. What about those membrane junctions we mentioned earlier?
Right, membrane junctions. These are specialized structures that allow cells to connect and communicate with each other.
So they're like the cell's social network.
Yeah, in a way, they're essential for building tissues and organs.
What are the different types of junctions?
Well, you have desmosomes, which are like strong rivets that hold cells together. They're particularly abundant in tissues that experience a lot of stretching, like skin.
Okay, so they provide mechanical strength.
Right. Then you have tight junctions, which create a very tight seal between cells, preventing leakage. They're important in tissues like the lining of the intestines, where you don't want things leaking out between cells.
So they're like the cell's sealant.
And finally, you have gap junctions, which are channels that allow small molecules and ions to pass directly from one cell to another.
So they're like direct communication lines.
Exactly. They allow cells to share signals and coordinate their activities.
Okay, so we've talked about the general features of cells and the different organelles. It's amazing how complex these tiny units of life are.
It is. And we can appreciate this complexity even more when we look at some specific cell types, like red blood cells, sperm cells, and neurons.
Okay, let's start with red blood cells. You mentioned earlier that they lose their nucleus.
They do. And they also lose most of their other organelles.
So they're pretty much just bags of hemoglobin.
Essentially, yes. And that's what makes them so efficient at carrying oxygen.
Okay, what about sperm cells?
Sperm cells are highly specialized for their role in fertilization.
They have that distinctive shape with the head and the tail.
Right. The head contains the nucleus, which carries the father's DNA, and an acrosome, which is a sac of enzymes that help the sperm penetrate the egg.
Okay, so the head is all about delivering the DNA.
Exactly. And the mid-piece, the part just behind the head, is packed with mitochondria.
Mitochondria. Why so many?
Because swimming requires a lot of energy. The mitochondria provide the ATP needed to power the tail, which is a long flagellum that propels the sperm towards the egg.
It's like a tiny self-propelled torpedo.
A very accurate analogy.
But what about neurons?
Neurons are nerve cells. They're specialized for transmitting electrical signals throughout the body.
They have that distinctive shape too, with the long axon and the branching dendrites.
Right. The dendrites receive signals from other neurons, and the axon transmits signals to other neurons, muscles, or glands.
So they're like the wiring of the nervous system.
Exactly. And the connections between neurons, called synapses, are where the real magic happens.
Okay, so we've seen how different cell types have evolved unique structures to carry out their specialized roles. It's really quite amazing.
It is. It shows how structure and function are intimately related in biology.
And it makes you realize that even though cells are tiny, They're incredibly complex and dynamic.
Right. And understanding how cells work is essential for understanding how our bodies work, how diseases develop, and how we can develop new treatments.
So we've covered a lot of ground today. Any final thoughts?
Well, we've talked about how incredibly complex and interconnected the cell is, all the different organelles working together in harmony. It makes you wonder, what happens when things go wrong at the cellular level?
Like when one of the organelles malfunctions.
Exactly. Or when the communication between cells breaks down. These disruptions, even at the microscopic level, can have far-reaching consequences for the entire organism.
It's like a domino effect.
It can be. And that's why studying cell biology is so important. It helps us understand the root causes of disease and develop new ways to treat them.
It's a fascinating and ever-evolving field.
Absolutely. And it's something we should all be aware of because ultimately our health depends on the health of our cells.
Great point. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive today. It's been a fascinating journey into the microscopic world of the cell.
It's been my pleasure. I hope everyone listening has a newfound appreciation for these incredible building blocks of life.